Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be asked to speak to you tonight on the Archaeology of Divis in the Black Mountain. And obviously, my thanks go out to the Belfast Hills Partnership team for inviting me to give you this talk. By way of a quick introduction, as Joe said, I'm the National Trust Archaeologist based in Northern Ireland region. And that means I support the Trust in understanding and looking after its historic environment resources and its assets across all its properties in Northern Ireland. So this evening's talk is going to focus on some discoveries made, particularly over the last few years. But it's also going to hark back a little bit to the information and the data that we've been compiling on the property since the trust acquired the land in 2004. So in those very early stages around that time of acquisition, the trust had carried out desktop survey, field surveys across the landscape, and this was all in an effort to better understand what it contained, both from an historical and an archaeological perspective, but also to assess its environmental potential. And this, of course, was a farmed landscape when the trust acquired it, but it also contains parcels of ground in which there's key infrastructure. So the telecommunications masts and relays which have been erected, and also the lands that were being transferred to the trust were from the previous owner, the Ministry of Defence, signaling almost as it is that from the early 70s at least, and this was a bit of a militarized landscape, and I'll touch on that a little bit shortly. For those of you, and I'm sure you're all probably aware of Divis, but for any of you who's not really aware of Divis and Black Mountain, it's been in the care of the Trust since 2004. And though some additional land acquisitions were made, growing the area from about 607 hectares or about 1,500 acres to what today the Trust looks after, which is over 2,594 acres or over 1,000 hectares. And this now includes part of the escarpment, which falls down from the northwestern side of the mountain itself towards Belfast. So as said, this is an upland landscape affording quite stunning views over Belfast, particularly from Black Mountain. And obviously beyond as well, comprising a mosaic of grassland, heathland bog, and it's home to a host of wildlife and archaeological remains. So you can see on the slide on your view there that it rests in the centre of the Belfast Hills, and it rises to 1,568 feet. And obviously its peaks define much of the western horizon of Belfast City. And I put this on to sort of point out where sort of Divis sort of sits in that Belfast Hills range, the fact that there are other accessible properties through the Belfast Hills, and then the range of other landowners and partners who work with the Belfast Hills Partnership in delivering environmental sort of surveys, public access, and generally looking after the hills. I've thrown this slide on really because with any knowledge of a landscape, and certainly whenever as an archaeologist you're trying to sort of detail what you know there, you'll see in a moment or two that there are a lot of sites that are already recorded in the landscape. So before you, and it probably answers the question also, well, how do archaeologists know where to excavate? How do they know where to look for sites, or how do they know how to identify them? So there's a massive amount of information that is already out there. It's part of the historical appraisal of the site, which when you combine all these little elements of information together, it starts to draw the picture for you. And that includes historical documents, maps, aerial photographs, environmental research. There's a whole knowledge bank of information that you can apply and collate to try and understand a landscape. And of course, as you walk around, there's ruined buildings, there's earthwork features. All this information is key in trying to understand the landscape. And the slide that I have in front of you is a very early map. In fact, it's one of the earliest sort of detailed maps. This is the Crow map, which was drawn for the Marquis of Donegal. And it basically shows, as you would expect, a snapshot of what the land holding was at the time, in this case in the 1770s. And of course, what it does is it puts both townland names on, it puts features in the landscape on, possibly also for navigational purposes. But the other thing, when you look at part of the map as well, it has all the land divided into various parcels. So these are little leaseholds or farming areas. And of course, the people that were on those parcels of land were holding those under a lease from the Donegal estate. So it's quite an important document in the sense that it shows you where there are field boundaries, where there are houses or dwellings. Later on, these become more detailed in the sense that they actually say what is being used in terms of the agricultural practice, whether it's arable or whether it's grazing in various areas. And it will give you details of those parcels in terms of acres, rods, and perches. So lots of information to be gleaned from this. Likewise, a lot of these documents, I should point out, are in the collections of Public Records Office, Northern Ireland, which, of course, if you go to, you can consult these documents. And so, for example, this, again, pre-ordnance survey is an 1820 map, which is the Thomas Pattison map, which is produced for William Hunter, Esquire, originally from Dunmurry. So this is part of a lease agreement that Hunter was undertaking with the Donegals to first of all lease and then finally acquire Divis and Black Mountain. The critical thing about this is it actually marks down, as you can see on the right hand side, adjacent landowners or adjacent tenants who were part of Donegal's estate. But again, I mean, it's little bits of information. For example, you can see coming from sort of Divis, which is sort of top center almost of that map, that you actually have a block plantation of trees in that. Not something that anybody would think you would have up on Divis, and certainly is not up there at present time. So there's real good information that you can get from these maps. And then we go into things like the First Ordnance Survey. So this is 1834, and you're starting to see, again, more detail this time on the maps. And then this is all linked, obviously, into Griffith's valuation and then the subsequent valuations that happen in the landscape, which is a result of the detailed mapping, which then quite literally allows you to put people on parcels of land. You have named individuals, you know who was farming what area, because it basically gives it to you in acres, rods, and perches, and you can find out whether they're the landowner or whether they're a leaseholder. And then as you go through sequences right through to the 20s and after, you have these valuation books, which actually are a good way of being able to see how land changes hand, as this slide illustrates, where, for example, Hunter is in effect bought out by or transfers the ownership of the land to Templeton, Viscount Templeton. And an interesting story then, if you go and research that, was that Templeton was then seeking to turn particularly Divis Mountain, into a sort of a sporting venture, you could say, because it was basically being used for organized shoots and for fishing. So the sporting interest that happened there. So again, I mean, all this information and documents telling you that there was buildings there and what the value of them were, even down to the census, where in this case you can see named individuals, a shepherd, and who else was actually living in the house. So early 20th century, fantastic records that that the census provides. Um, when you've collated all this sort of documentary and background research, it's then boots on the ground. You have to go out into the landscape and you have to verify and search out the various sites that are either shown on maps and aerial photographs. And then that's really just to start recording those and figuring out what the sequence of these and potentially what the date of them are. What we found when we were going around Divis in the early years after the Trust had acquired it was a lot more buildings than we previously thought were actually there, to the point that there's at least around about 10 farms that have, you know, the foundation remains of buildings still surviving there. And I put these slides up because I haven't done this as an exercise on my own. I'm only sort of what they call one deep for the National Trust, so a single archaeologist. So since around about 2005, the Ulster Archaeology Society have been doing a massive amount of survey work, volunteering their time in recording this and other, indeed, landscapes. And there are numerous reports that have been compiled, including all the historical documentation and all the mapping and everything else that we've basically been able to sort of put online, and they're free to access. And if you just search Ulster Archaeology Society and its field survey reports, you'll be able to see individual reports on lots of the different either house structures, cairns, and other field monuments that have actually been recorded on the mountain. Now, and I know he's actually on the call because I saw him on it. David Craig is the chap that's standing in this photograph. And we also avail ourselves, where possible, of new technology whenever that's made available. There is LiDAR, aerial photography, but sometimes the use of drones with very high definition, high resolution photography is another method of being able to sort of scrutinize and investigate the landscape. And I'll show you some of the output from that later. But this, for example, is an early aerial photograph from the western side of Divis and Black Mountain, and this shows firing range, which we know was put in. It's a 600-yard rifle range that was put in 1943. And you can see two little Nissen huts, which are located, if I can get my marker pen here, sorry, 1 second. For anyone that knows the site where the Divis Road car park is, the Nissen huts that sort of dominate that car park are sitting there on the sort of center of the photograph. The other thing that we found from this as well was that, and we're fortunate when the transfer happened between MOD and the Trust, we managed to get some what were previously restricted aerial photographs that had been undertaken by Ministry of Defence of the property themselves. Really good resolution, high resolution on it. And again, these are little snapshots in times with certain monuments on the site, which I'll go into in more detail shortly. But these, for example, that I've got on screen now are photographs that were taken of what are known as sheepfolds. And the one on the right is the focus of 3 different seasons of excavations since 2017 through to this year that we've actually been undertaking, and I'm going to present results on those shortly. LiDAR, I'm not going to go into this in a terrible lot of detail, but it is another way of sort of mapping the ground and looking for subtle and slight variations in ground level and surface level. So trying to sort of pick out potentially features that would be barely perceptible to the eye on the ground. You can, by software packages and so forth, exaggerate these sort of hillshades and create models that actually allow you to sort of see in greater detail and with greater clarity features that are quite slight, to be totally honest. But on the examination so far of the LiDAR from Divis, we're not seeing a massive amount of previously unknown or so far unrecorded archaeological remains. But we may well continue our efforts with those that are more expert than I to try and sort of go through this software package and see what it delivers. But it's all valuable information, which leads into this. This is the Historic Environment Map Viewer. I thought this is the best way to illustrate what is in the Historic Environment Record for Northern Ireland. And this is what the Department, Historic Environment Division, Department for Communities, has as a publicly available resource. So you can Google this, you can go into any areas and you can put on layers of information, sites and monuments, defence heritage, industrial heritage, scheduled zones, everything, even archaeological investigations are now being loaded onto this. And so you'll see in the centre of this shot, there's a picture of Divis and Black Mountain. and it doesn't have a massive amount of sort of point data on it, which are sort of site locations. Um, that's not because there's not a lot of information there. It's just because I think historically there was very little survey being carried out, systematic survey being carried out on the mountain, particularly when it was under the control of the Ministry of Defence. But when you then allow teams to go out into the landscape and you start surveying in more detail, you then start seeing a progression from left to right in terms of the sort of known archaeology we have. And so this starts putting more detail on things like where buildings are, where field boundaries are. It would be a very easy opportunity as well to put up another map which actually shows you this all as what they call polygons, but it then becomes very busy because then all these anthropogenic features, you would call them, so all the man-made features in the landscape, then suddenly start going onto this as a layer. So this is how, first and foremost, you locate these things. And indeed, this is a range. This is not telling you other than there are features here which are of interest. But the reality of this is these are from the prehistoric period right through to, in effect, the middle of the 20th century. So all the various interventions that have been made in the landscape that we know of, we've been recording. Now, I put this up because as you can sort of see on the bottom there, this is an aerial view of what we call a closed canopy woodland, and it's a view of one taken in Ireland. Um, and the reason I'm putting this up is because most people will look at Divis and Black Mountain and think it's an open upland landscape. Has it always been like this? Well, short answer is no, it hasn't. And because we do have quite a lot of information that has been generated through research, particularly at Queen's University Belfast, where pollen cores have been taken, usually from soil monoliths, and that gives you a vegetational history that you can apply scientific dating on. So, just to put this into perspective, the first human settlers in the north part of Ireland arrived during a period known as the Mesolithic. So that dates to around about 8,000 to 4,000 BC. And their range and exploitation of the landscape was determined by the environment that they encountered. So this is following the post-glacial ice retreat. And that's basically when Ireland becomes effectively separated from Britain by rising sea level. And so the Mesolithic people across Ireland were a relatively small population, we think. And from archaeological evidence, we know that they moved in seasonal and you would also say cyclical routes through the landscape. So they're hunting and gathering and fishing as the main sort of subsistence or lifestyle, with not what you would call permanent settlements. And what their technology tells us is that it's stone tool based, hunting points, blades, scrapers, that sort of thing. But you won't find pottery, and you certainly won't find all the accoutrements that go with an agricultural sort of subsistence economy. Um, One of the key things about Divis and Black Mountain is that, and anyone that knows it, is big basalt heap, which basically is the mountain itself. But below that is limestone. And from the limestone, you get chalk nodules, and that's basically the main resource throughout prehistory, particularly in the Mesolithic and Neolithic, for making stone tools. So it's not surprising for us when we find, and I quite literally think that in most sort of scrapes that I come across on the mountain, there are struck flint tools there. So there is an activity going on, and that's linked to the fact that there are resources right at hand on the escarpment of the mountain. So turning to the palynology, I mean, the earliest one was done in about 1920s, I think, and it was a chap called Kirkland who did an investigation on the summit of Divis, and he was at the time postulating that the blanket bog on Divis and Black Mountain was starting to form sometime 5,200, 2,200 BC. And so that's a time span running in effect from the later Mesolithic right through to what we call the early Bronze Age. But more detailed and accurately dated sequences have come, particularly in 2014. Where Dr. James Perkins from Queen's examines sediments from monolith, and that suggests that, for example, around 8,130 BC. Immediate landscape surrounding Divis and the Black Mountain was dominated by open water and reed swamp. And so making these damp conditions their home started being numbers of willow and birch. About 320 years later, birch is able to thrive in an otherwise treeless landscape, and then you get willow levels declining, wetlands disappearing due to expanding grassland up to around about 7,490. And then you run through a whole sequence of these things, which basically then starts showing that the Divis pollen shows a clear dominance of arboreal pollen. And that sort of demonstrates that a closed canopy, mixed woodland, was established and consolidated on the site by 6,920 BC. So in the Mesolithic, the early Mesolithic. And throughout much of that period, it suggests that mixed woodland closed canopy continued to dominate the whole surrounding landscape. We do see within those sort of pollen records that there are various sort of like spreads of different taxa of trees, and you've got a pollen decline and an elm decline. But what it does is it then starts bringing us into the periods in which we have information, both monuments and the flint scatters, that we know people were populating the area more heavily. And so that's in the Neolithic. And even indeed until the early Bronze Age, and that runs from a whole sort of 4,000 BC to 1500 BC. But what we do find is that the landscape, while it might thin out at times in terms of the tree cover, it doesn't become the landscape we see today. And in many ways, one of the critical things that is interesting when you think about how the landscape, how the mountain is being used, there is no sign of any pollen which would be associated with agricultural activity. So when we think about the Neolithic period, and I think I have another shot here of, sort of like a closed canopy forested ridge. But I mean, this is the sort of views that you would think in that earlier prehistory of what Divis would have looked like. So then we bring ourselves forward. Well, what is the earliest sort of evidence that we have, archaeologically speaking, for any monuments on the site? And it's this one, which conveniently is actually shown and illustrated and marked as Giant's Grave on that crow map that I was talking about. And it's called a Giant's Grave for a reason, because it's a megalithic tomb. Now, we don't know what type of tomb this was, but given that it is drawn, we hope accurately, almost in a sort of like a rectangular fashion, which seems to suggest that it's what we call a court tomb. And these are quite literally from the early Neolithic. The position of it, you can see, is in the townland at the very far north of Divis, which is called Altagaran. The reason I've put this on is because we have other cairns on the mountain which do survive. And indeed, this one is located just off the summit of Divis itself. And there's a number of these. I think in last count, there was around about 11 known. And so you'll see from this slide, they have been documented before. And in fact, people were taking photographs on them. The chap on the very far right, Mr. Dunlop is his name, is standing actually on top of the cairn. And you can see two boys in a photograph, which we believe was taken in around about 1924, sitting on a OS trig pillar, which sits in the middle of the cairn. Now, why I'm showing you this is because even though today there is no physical remains of a cairn on the summit, the actual summit itself, for example, there were Ordnance Survey surveyors. In this case, this was in the 1940s when they were undertaking a retriangulation, particularly for new trig points to go in. Or new trig pillars to go in. And you can clearly see in one of the surveyor's sketchbooks here that he actually marks the cairn, shows the trig pillar in the centre of it, and even goes to the issue of marking where the nearest sort of brick hut is. And the image on the right shows the early formation in the early 70s of what became Key Point, so the MOD telecommunications complex that then went on to the summit. And you can clearly see by marking it there where the trig pillar is, and the cairn is still intact at that time. in the early 70s. Now, as a comparison for that, this is a cairn similar, which is unsleeved honored. And this is known to be a Neolithic passage tomb. And there's another cairn close by to it, which would be called a satellite cairn, which is a multiple kiss cairn. And I'm not for any moment saying that that has to be what the cairns are or were on Divis Summit, but it makes a very interesting parallel. And considering that the two sites are actually intervisible, highly intervisible between each other. Um, when we look at the other cairns that are known on the mountain, one of them was investigated again in the 19th century. And the usual, sort of a drawing was made of, in this case, what's called a tripartite bowl recovered from Yellowjack's cairn. And the vessel is no longer, well, no one knows where it is. It was taken by the owner, Mr. Hunter, at the time, and so is not in any museum collection anywhere. And so the only sort of evidence of this we have are from these sort of documentary records of what happened and what was found at the time. But a circular cairn like this was obviously a burial monument, and this would date to the early Bronze Age. You see other remains of cairns similar to this dotted around the mountain. So, for example, this is right on Black Mountain itself, and that great view that it has down into Belfast, and you can see on the left-hand side, I've just arrowed to where that is, but it's close to one of the trig pillars. And of course, these are just dotted in key spots. Um, Alongside all those flint manufacturing sites, so lots of scatters of flint that we have known about and still find today, we then start sort of moving into what's called the Bronze Age period, and one of the sort of the most recognizable field monuments that we come upon there again is this one. It's marked on Crow's map in the late 18th century as Stumbling Stone. But this is basically the Ballygo Martin standing stone, which you can still visit up on the site today. An interesting feature about this is that it is associated with very early, quite large banked field boundaries, which there would be a slight suspicion a lot of these are not of modern construction, but might be to do with a more sort of medieval, if not an earlier enclosure that was going on in this landscape, but the site hasn't been investigated. Now, these standing stones, apart from the fact that cattle love them because they're scratching posts, sometimes they can be associated with a burial underneath them, usually a cremation, but a lot of the times they're actually seen as being sort of way markers in the landscape and territorial markers, if you will. Um, the uh, the other sort of, and I put this slide on really just because that little sort of cluster of sites that are around the Trig location on Black Mountain, there's a curious stone called the Bobby Stone, from which, of course, that whole area gets its name. Anybody who knows it well, who has been up at it, will see a sort of drill hole for a stick of dynamite as their attempt at one stage, I think, probably in the early to mid 19th century to blow it apart. But it certainly was to reduce its prominence, and you can see it there, bottom right of your screen. Now, sort of post-war, there were some investigations that were going on, usually when erosion happened or a path was being constructed. But we know that one of the archaeologists from the Archaeological Survey, and I think it may have been in the 1960s, found one of these hollow-based arrowheads, which again is Neolithic, close to where the Bobby Stone was. But of course, I mean, this starts to show you as well that not everything is what it seems. On the top right of this, right beside the trig pillar, and not that far from the Bobby Stone, you see these sort of hollows cut in the ground, and we believe that this actually might be a makeshift shelter location site for when Ordnance Survey surveyors were actually working up in the mountain, but it hasn't been excavated to establish that. And I've just put on here the sort of location again of the giant's grave, and you can see just to the sort of left-hand side of that its relationship again with the standing stone. In what is quite honestly in this map, and this is 1767, it's quite a like an unfeatured landscape. There are no contours on these maps, and there's no major field boundaries. And when you do see that happening is when the Ordnance Survey maps start appearing. Um, and then you start getting a little bit more definition, particularly even as you see here for these giants' grave. Um, we have undertaken sort of our own, if you will, detailed photographic surveys of this area in the hope that potentially vegetation might show where this former Giant's Grave site would be. And of course, this is sort of modeling from the sort of point cloud data that comes from the aerial photography to try and look at, as you can see on the left-hand side of this image, a lot of cultivation furrows that are across the ground, which might help sort of signify or even pinpoint a time at which the monument itself may have actually been physically removed, possibly just to make way for agricultural practice. And of course, center of that, we have the ruined remains of a farm complex that was up there, which obviously this field system relates to. There are, you'll also notice a few little sort of field boundaries and things like that that seem to come through in this. But to understand this landscape more would require a lot of reconnaissance, like particularly ground uh, uh, the remote sensing sort of techniques to be used on it to try and see what remains that is buried in the ground. Now, we did try ourselves with equipment called resistivity meter. It's a earth soil resistance, which is basically measuring soil moisture content. And essentially, what you're hoping to do is see contrast between areas that retain moisture in the soil and areas that are drier, and then the patterns that that might generate. And you can see the team here from the Ulster Archaeology Society is running this sort of quite simple apparatus to use on a grid pattern over what we could see as being sort of the site of where this Giant's Grave or former court tomb had been located. So again, just to locate the size of the grid, which is only 40 meters square. But then this is the sort of visualization that comes from the data set that you can process from this. We did this, I have to admit, and in front of some of my colleagues on this call, we probably did this at a too wide a resolution. And by that, I mean we didn't do it at a tight enough sampling strategy. So it is a site that this is possibly one of the very early sort of surveys that we did using this technique and equipment, but it allows us to go back and just that you never give up on sort of survey methodology. You'll go back with more equipment and maybe try different sort of survey techniques. But you can see in the sort of the top right of that, there is a sort of a block which is quite dark in this data set, which seems to stand out from the surrounding background. Now, whether or not that is actually the remains of the footing, the stone remains of where the cairn was, it's possible. We would probably do further survey on this. And then, as they always say in archaeology, when you've got all that information, then you would ground truth it. So that's when you would be potentially looking to open up an excavation trench over that to confirm what it is. So again, this is all about further information gathering about what we know and what we don't know. And there's another visualization of that, just sort of passing it through some filters to try and sort of highlight it more. And again, putting it on top of these terrain models that you can then generate from particularly the aerial photography. But of course, when we're out there, we're also looking at the other monuments that are close by. And that does include these abandoned farmsteads, which you can really get your teeth into because not only are you drawing plans of these, but you're also being able to go into a full documentary history of it. You can put named individuals into these farms, and then through things like valuation records and census records, you can build up a social history, which is fantastic. And you can see again that little farm and the parcel of it marked in these, what are valuation maps from the mid 19th century. Again, just running through those. Now, when we come out of the prehistoric period, the one thing that the the sort of like the ridge of Divis and Black Mountain does not seem to have is sort of Iron Age or even early medieval remains. So we don't see, and we haven't so far found any physical traces of monuments from that period. That's not to say that the landscape wasn't being used at that time, but when we start going off the mountain itself and down onto the escarpment, then we do see, particularly in Ballygo Martin Townland, there are two quite fine univalent or single ditched ring forts. So these are the farmsteads of the sort of free farming class in early medieval Ireland, and the monuments that survive there again. They're scheduled or protected, but they haven't been excavated, and they certainly have no information about date. However, from excavated examples of ring forts, particularly in the north here, we are pretty confident that these would be sort of like latter half of the first millennium AD, sometimes running into maybe even the 11th, 12th, 13th century in terms of a longer use of them and occupation of them. So we do have early Christian or early medieval remains as you start proceeding down the escarpment. There are also remains that show up literally through erosion. In this case, this was quite a number of years back, and I've circled it in red there. There was one of the sites that we recorded. This is an aircraft crash, which I'll hopefully have time talk about a little bit later. But essentially, this is 1948. This wasn't from during the wartime period, but it's a light aircraft that went down. Normally, in circumstances where military aircraft go down, those are sort of protected sites, and you're not allowed to excavate them without the right permissions. Now, what that does lead into as well is a very big component of activity that went on the site, certainly from possibly even the late 1930s, but certainly during the Second World War period. And again, this aerial photograph is showing you top end of the shooting gallery or the firing range, and the little sort of platforms or the firing positions that were on that arranged at intervals, with what is called the target gallery and the butts. That's that white piece in the aerial photograph is the butts. So basically where all the bullets go into. But what you'll notice if you look up on that aerial photograph, you'll see a very pitting of the landscape. Dark little sort of spots all over the place, and there appears to have been potentially aerial ordnance or bombs dropped in the landscape. These seem to be quite large for just mortars. One of the things about Divis and Black Mountain, particularly during the Second World War, when it was used heavily for training, was that it wasn't just a target range; it was also a free firing training area, and that could go up as far as Ballyutog across to Ballygo Martin, and as far down south as Hannistown. So it was a big area that was being used for troops training. For a lot of us, we'll all remember that during the Troubles, when the key point site was constructed up on Divis Summit itself. That then becomes another sort of militarization and military use of the landscape. But in many cases, and throughout actually most of that, and in between it, it was being used by farmers, potentially and mainly sheep farming activity. But of course, the key point site is now being removed. There's only the, shall we say, the blue lights telecommunication towers, which are separate from the commercial ones, which are on the summit. And of course, that's a photograph on the left of it taken prior to its demolition in 2008. And there are other buildings of it. A lot of the sort of observation posts or OPs and and other sort of, we wouldn't quite call them sangers, but there were operational buildings within the military landscape that were all taken down. Strangely, this one has remained on the right hand side, which is telecommunications or communications intercept building. And it's visible to the sort of north side of the firing range. Um, when you turn yourself or your attention over to Ballygomartin, so the other side of the hill going down in the escarpment, there are indeed other sort of military remains that survive there, some of which are from the Second World War or potentially even earlier. And I put this shot up because I can get the marker on this. It's just to highlight it on it. Oh, sorry. I won't be able to get that. Sorry. What I was trying to show you was this, which I think when myself and the team from UAS went out and had a look at this first, we were actually quite convincing ourselves that this might be something like a rabbit warren sort of device or construction. They're sometimes called pillow mounds. But the reality of it is, it's actually more of these firing positions, even though when I asked uh, um, a colleague in Ministry of Defence to check whether or not there was actually any firing ranges on Ballygomartin, the short answer back was nope, no record of it. So two of these have so far been found within Ballygomartin, and they are 100 yards apart. And so it looks like we have part of a former small arms firing range located there as well. Alongside that, recording in that area, there's lots of old abandoned farm buildings that reside there. A lot of those are actually shown not just on modern and ordnance survey maps, but so these things like the Donegal estate map. Now, with all that information collated, then what do when you're going out into the landscape and you're seeing an opportunity to learn even more about it? I think this, to kick off what archaeology can show you when you do a project on the site and when you know where to look. And this was one that was carried out in 2013, and you'll see at the bottom there 987 people took part in a public excavation over a 4-week period in May and April. And this was where, if people are familiar with Divis, this is where the car park sits outside the cafe barn. And so when this was being stripped through with planning permission, we saw an opportunity to do some excavation here. It was thought that there was possibly only really just going to be scatters of flint that would come up. Um, but very, very quickly, we were finding there was, you see bottom left there, there's lots of lazy bed cultivation that was going on. There was a few little pits and post holes that showed up. But the main thing actually that came was the larger image top left. And we found remains of a small single roomed vernacular building, which was not shown on any of the more historic maps, and didn't have that much cultural material with it, certainly from the surface of it, that you could date it easily. But there was a fragment of pottery, which was believed to be potentially 17th century. Now, there's another view of it and how it was excavated. And you can see top right, this is again from these historic collections of photographs, in this case, William A. Green, held by the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum, or the Ulster Museum, if it's the Welsh collection. So this was the sort of snapshots in time that the photographers from the late 19th century, early 20th century were documenting, sort of these old ways of life in the countryside. And it's remarkable that, they turned their attention to documenting and recording some of these old buildings. So really, just to try and show you what something like this would have looked like, you're effectively looking at the floor of the building. Its walls have been pulled down, and that's quite possibly because the walls were actually constructed in sod. And these were quite sort of low-cost buildings in a sense to actually construct, but also reflect more about the people that occupied them, usually farm labourers and people of a lower sort of social status, obviously. So this is actually still preserved in situ at the far end or the bottom end of the car park up on Divis. Um, we knew, obviously, as you can see, bottom left, there it is, and there's Divis Lodge adjacent to it, that there was possibly something else going on there. So we excavated in 2024 the sort of green area to the north side of Divis Lodge. And these are great aerial shots to just show you excavation in process on this. Now, what this excavation showed to us was a combination of what we believe were possibly cultivation furrows, but also we were thinking that this was to do with flax cultivation on the site. Now, we had no real evidence that you had a series of channels which flax could have been retted in, and then you had these sort of stone strips beside them on which then the retted flax could be put out. But what we did do was we went back a little time later and said, well, okay, well, like, let's just go over this area again using the geophysical survey technique. And this is what we find. Now, I mean, this is a lot larger. This is about 30 meters square. This is a lot larger than the area that we excavated. But what you can see in this sort of center of that photograph or that slide is the grayscale image of the processing of that scan data or that survey data. And there seems to be quite a marked it's almost sort of keyhole shaped, inverted, but there's a large area in the center of it, almost like circular or teardrop shaped, which we believe possibly is the remains of a large retting pool. But again, it's another one where we would need to now go back and possibly excavate there just to establish both the date and the function of that. And that's really just to show you what these again, historic photographs, William A. Green, I think the other one's a Welsh photograph of how this practice went on in the landscape at that time. We do know, for example, that during the Second World War, flax production and retting and all those things were brought back in basically because of the need for materials. So where it had literally in agricultural areas gone out of use, it was brought back in again just because there was a need for it. Now, one of the sites that we've really focused attention on in terms of the excavations and trying to learn more about particular sites is this large stone enclosure, which I think, I mean, we've tried to sort of figure out, well, in an origin fashion, how did this come about? Because it's marked as a sheepfold, particularly on the second edition Ordnance Survey map. So it's actually annotated as such. And a curious thing as well is that it's actually shown as being partly roofed or covered. Now we can go through the information, particularly from valuations and so forth, and figuring out that that this would have been done at a time when William Hunter, was the owner of the mountain. But it does have a sort of a feel of a sort of a prehistoric monument to it. There's very little sort of mortar visible in it. There's a lot of monolithic large stones have been sort of like set on end and erected to actually form the perimeter of this. So purely as an exercise to try and date the site and see if there's a continuity of settlement here or a succession of different sort of monument types on the site. We undertook an excavation in 2017, and this again was with Belfast Hills Partnership with Queen's University, really just like a big joint operation to try and sort of investigate the site for the first time. And so this is a drone photograph directly overhead showing the position of the trench, but also some of the remains, and it puts in context what we find. So you're looking at an enclosure that's a little over, it's not completely circle, but it's a little over sort of 20 meters in diameter. And what you have is on the lower portion, so that is surrounded by that orange barrier tape where the excavation trench is, that southern circuit of it seems to, you can physically see it, is formed by an outer wall and then a series of inner wall lines which seem to mark out these little cells or compartments against it. So the question was, well, I mean, is this part of the same monument? Is this an adaptation of it? How much of this is to do with uh, the development of the site? I'm going to run on a little bit. The development of the site, from prehistory into the historic periods or the modern period. Well, what we did find was pretty quickly on excavation is that we had bonded, and by that I mean mortar bonded walls, which you wouldn't expect to find, particularly even in the medieval period, early medieval period here, and certainly not in prehistory. So you can see on the left there is an overview and part of that excavation, these sort of internal division walls, which are marking out a compartment. What we did notice, though, when we excavated down through this, was that this appeared to be directly over deposits which were holding prehistoric remains. And in that sense, we got um, Neolithic pottery, very small shards of it, but we also got carbonized material that we were able to radiocarbon date. But unfortunately for us, it didn't tally with the Neolithic pottery that was found. It turned out to be a late Bronze Age radiocarbon date. So there's a little bit of a conundrum that was starting to develop even as you were coming out from that excavation. And it is what we'd normally call keyhole, in the sense that we put a long, narrow trench there just as an investigation. So when you then start thinking of, there's a little sort of plan of the site, a view again over the top of it without any of the trench locations, you can start to sort of see this sort of thicker sort of circuit to it with the compartments inside it in the sort of south of the circular enclosure there. That's just putting you through some of the sort of scan material and the level of detail that we put onto that. But then you sort of fast forward into last year, where we then decided to, well, I mean, let's go in and further examine it, look to see whether or not what's the extent of the prehistoric remains, and if we can get any more sort of finds and material that can help date sequences on it. And so this, I think, is a great shot taken by our friend and colleague in this enterprise, David Craig. I mean, and this just literally illustrates, sort of the location of the site and then the people on it. But it also shows you that far from being a small test trench, we had opened quite a large excavation area. In fact, it was over 17 meters long and about 6 meters wide or deep. And of course, this again was something that we opened to public participation. Um, Now, before I sort of run through what we found on it, after we came away from the excavation and based on some of the findings, we decided to do some geophysical survey. And these are visualizations called grayscale plots of what we find there. And this is then putting them onto, shall we say, like the mapping evidence, or using GPS coordinates to locate the corners of those survey grids. And this was really just to see whether or not there was any clear settlement evidence that was potentially there to be found beyond the line of enclosure. Now, there are a few linear trends, you would call them, so lines that are sort of running north-south as you see it on the screen, and others that cut across it. And we do know that there are a lot of drains now associated with this site. So that's what we're initially finding, and potentially there also in this sort of darker area directly south of the enclosure. It looks like we have some further features which it's hard to say exactly what they constitute, but it might be a target for future investigation to ground truth what those are. And there's just an additional grid. So whenever we did this excavation, and of course I've reported on this in a previous year, Um, the community excavation did show up quite a lot of Neolithic pottery from us, and then of course, if we run through these ones again, this is just to show you then the information that we originally had. MOD photography on the left. This is the map I was referring to, which actually notifies this enclosure as being a sheepfold, mid 19th century. And there was another one located several hundred meters away from it. And so this is our trench plan as we undertook in 2017 over. So quite a large area that was excavated. Um, and then this really just gives you an indication of what we find. Largely cobbled, the whole interior of it. Some of the areas more densely than others. But as you would walk into the enclosure through a entranceway, which you'll see I've marked there, there's a ranging rod at the top of it. This is just over 3 meters deep or wide, and had a lovely cobbled surface right throughout it. We did find that, in effect, what we had was a little compartment, which partly had been excavated in the 2017 trench, but we weren't sure of its full dimensions. And when we removed the material, the cobbled surface, the 19th century activity from inside that, we did find prehistoric features. But you can see just where I've written hearth on that plan, there's a large circular depression that's been sort of that you can physically see in the ground. That's actually the remains of a hearth. So what we're looking at here is the shepherd's hut. And there was the last fire was still remaining in it with burnt timber and metal waste and various other bits and pieces that were in it. So it in effect corroborates and backs up the fact that we know this was used as a sheepfold. We also then, this is where we found the stone lined drains. Um, but to the left hand side of the image, as you look at it, which is more towards the center of the enclosure itself, this is where we started seeing prehistoric features lying almost directly below this 19th century activity. There's a shot just of some of our excavators clearing below these sort of cobbled surfaces. So going from 19th century straight down into the prehistoric deposits. Um, we did have, for example, a stone set for the gate post at the entranceway. And there's another view as well of the drain that was excavated. So the pottery that we got, quite actually a lot of it, over 50 sherds of prehistoric pottery were recovered from those prehistoric features. Two main concentrations in particular. And this large pit that you see sort of center top of the image on the left is really where the majority of the pottery came from, and this is what it looks like. So slight representation. There's not enough fragments here really to do a full reconstruction of the vessel. But by and large, this is plain, what they call shouldered bowl or carinated bowl form. So on these sort of reconstructed or intact vessels that you've got in the museum collections, and this would be the of the bottom left, this would be the sort of the middle one of that type in terms of what the form of this vessel takes. And of course these are early to middle Neolithic period pottery vessels, and as part of the first farmers. We did have one sherd of decorated pottery that came from this. This would be like you would call it in typology terms a little bit like a Ballyalton bowl. So this is what they call a necked vessel, and it has cord ornamented decoration upon it. Even some of the pottery sherds as well were showing what we call grass marks on the vessels. It's great because, I mean, the pottery being handmade, when it's left to dry on the ground, it picks up the impressions and sometimes even seeds and other remains. Even human fingerprints can be found on these sort of pottery vessels. And talking of seeds, one of the key things that we found was that we were getting cereal remains up here. Now, this posed a little bit of an issue for us because, as I pointed out earlier on, when quite comprehensive pollen analysis being done on the site. There's no evidence that during the Neolithic period or even into the Bronze Age that the site itself or the mountain was being cultivated, certainly not for crops. So what we do think was going on here is that potentially this area that we've now excavated is in effect like a camp for we call it transhumance, but it's like bullion at later periods. So where you take cattle, potentially sheep as well, up into an upland environment away from your agricultural, arable fields, and you do a summer grazing up there. And so that what we're looking at is pits and post holes forming what we believe to be the remains of a sort of a seasonal structure that may have been up there. Now we're still waiting to get radiocarbon dates from this, but based on the information that we've got on the pottery and the flint tools, things like scrapers, and just the debitage and other struck material, we're quite confident that we're looking at a sort of an occupation use period here for around about 3,000 or 3,200 BC. So this sort of like just shows you again the larger pits in that, a concentration of pottery marked brown there, these post hole alignments that seem to start coming through. So we've got structures there. But again, I mean, you need to start expanding on excavation to find where this extends to. So this brings us to the investigation that we did this year, 2025. And we weren't probably opening as large an area as we had opened last year, but we were hoping that we would find just a natural continuation of prehistoric remains, again underneath the 19th century activity. And of course, as we were going down, encountering the cobble surfaces again, because we're in the interior of this enclosure from the 19th century, we're getting like iron rings and lots of nail fragments and so forth. So all the sort of stuff that seems to be there from the 19th century. But then we did start seeing features come through this. Some of these, as you'll see in this nice little sort of stones arranged in alignment there, are actually drains, and drains that date from the contemporary use of the enclosure as a sheepfold. But you did start to see, and this I think illustrates for those that have never been on an excavation, these sort of contrasts where how you find these buried features. It's usually just different variations of soil type, or how moisture is retained in one area and not in another, where stone congregates or is used as packing material. And this allows you to see the variations where burning happens on a site as well as another technique. So I mean, those are all things that are experienced and learned as you're on the excavation. For the main two trenches that we'd excavated within or the extension to the west side of where we dug last year, there wasn't a massive amount of prehistoric pottery, for example, that came up. But we did get several sherds, which I have photographed even on the site at the time there. And again, these are of this carinated bowl variety, and these types are what are called fluted, but only several small sherds, but one of them is a rim. So we're still seeing contemporary material, the same type of material. These are in effect sort of like laser scans, just showing you the progression in the various trenches as we're excavating down through it. But our main trench, and with its sort of T of drainage channels running through it there, these were these were enough information. There were enough features that came through in this that we can actually start to see a continuation both of the pits and the post holes. But it's still not enough to be able to sort of in a definite way align out a clear structure on the site. But it is showing that prehistoric remains are physically there. I thought I had one last slide to show you. I will come out of this. One of the features that we've got that we always sort of plan for what the next investigation might be. I think it's probably worthwhile to sort of share with you is that we are doing more environmental research on the site. We're doing deeper pollen cores out of what we now believe are like 2 meter depth deposits of peat, which we find up on Divis. And the critical thing for that is because so far all the pollen analysis, the environmental archaeology we have literally stops at the Bronze Age. So for example, when I was saying that we've got gaps in our knowledge and we don't know much about the Iron Age or the medieval period and even the later medieval activity on the mountain, hopefully the pollen sequences that will get generated will be from prehistory right through to the present day. And that should allow us to see what activity was happening there, when agricultural activity started, particularly things like the lazy beds going in as well, and we can radiocarbon date those. But this is only a snapshot of some of the archaeological research that has been happening, I suppose, on a site that the Trust has had for, this must be 20 years. I'm just looking at Joe on that screen there going, how long has Divis been in Trust ownership and open to the public?
2000,
So
2005, I think, wasn't it?
2005, and we are 2025.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, 20 years. It's and it also shows that there is always opportunity for further research. Thank you.